Welcome to the Cherry Hills Church podcast. We're in a teaching series called Origin Story, studying the book of Genesis as the foundation of the whole story of the gospel. Thanks for joining us as we learn who God has always been and who we are as part of his story.
A reading from Genesis chapter 4. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. When the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out from me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment, it's more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning, friends. It's good to be with you in worship. My name is Luke. I'm the spiritual formation minister here. And today we're continuing in our series through the book of Genesis called Origin Story. And we'll be in Genesis chapter 4 in the story that you just heard read for us about Cain and Abel. If you want to follow along in the Bibles, there's some black Bibles under the seats. We'd love to have you in the Word with us. Now we're digging back into the origins of the human story some more today as we look at Genesis 4. And digging into the past isn't always cheery. No one has ever walked out of a session of therapy and said, "It was all good news today. I have no childhood wounds. There's no generational trauma, no baggage from my past. They just said I was a clean blank slate." That's not how it tends to go. Each of us is not a blank, clean slate. Each of us has a history, has an origin story that's shaped who we are as individuals, and reckoning with the past, even and especially the bad news, is essential for cultivating a healthy, flourishing life and helping us to live a better story and live into the good news. Just as we each have individual origin stories, we have collective shared origin stories, communal origin stories. And if we dig into the past and our communal origin stories, we can understand how those events have shaped our collective identity. And they have explanatory power for the human experience. That is, they can make sense of why the world is the way it is and why we are the way that we are. And that is essentially what Genesis is. It's giving us a shared communal origin story to help us make sense of things. That's why it was written for the people of Israel. That's why we continue to study it today. So as we said each week in this series, if you're following in your notes, Genesis is the origin story of who God is and who we are. So today we're going to do some digging into our family of origin. If you talk to a psychologist, psychologists will tell you 2, 3, 4 generations back, that's had the most impact on who you are today. If you talk to a theologian, they'll tell you, you got to go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. That's your ancestors in Eden. They've had the most impact on who you are today. And of course, both are each correct in their own way. Just as we've picked up some patterns of healthy or unhealthy functioning from the homes that we grew up in, so too we've picked up some cycles of sin that have characterized God's family from the very first image bearers back in the days of Eden. So understanding the story that the Bible is telling about Eden not only helps us make sense of the gospel story, the story the rest of the Bible is about, but also it's essential to understanding our own modern day cycles of sin, why we do the things that we do. We all have cycles and patterns and predictable behaviors in our life. I'll give you an example. When I was growing up, I had an older brother, 2 years older than me, and we would go to the park and we would play basketball. And my brother has always been, still is, a better basketball player than I am, but we were both pretty competitive. And as I got a little older, maybe around 13, 14, somewhere in there, I just like sprung up and I got tall, right? And so then it got fierce, the rivalry, you know? And so the predictable cycle we would get in and week out, we would go there. And I'd have to fact check this with my brother, I'm sure, but I want to say it's like 50% of the time we would go walk to the park, it's like a quarter mile from our house, and we would just get into trouble. You know, something would happen, and we'd end up yelling at each other, you fouled, you cheated, that was just lucky, you're trash, you know, we would just like get at it. And there was always some kind of conflict that was really likely to brew when we stepped onto the basketball court at the park. We would just kind of go at it with each other, getting into a fight. And I remember it happened frequently enough that we would sometimes have this conversation after really getting in each other's face, like, you can't storm off and go home alone right now. Because if I don't come home with you and we're not smiling when we walk in the door, you know what's going to happen. Like, we got to figure this out because we don't want to repeat history again and again. We keep getting in trouble when we go home like this. Like, we got to sort this out. You know, we're trying to strategize because we know the pattern of what to expect when you go home in conflict yet again. And the number of times we would just like punt that basketball in rage, losing our temper on the court, more than I can count. Cycles, right? Patterns, repeating history over and over and over again. So let me put forward a question for us this morning. What does it take to break free from cycles of sin? How do you avoid repeating history and getting stuck on the hamster wheel and cycling through the same old behaviors? Let me put this in biblical terms for us. How do we stop walking in what Jude in the New Testament calls the way of Cain and start walking in the way of Jesus? This isn't hypothetical questions, not theoretical. Some of us know better than others what it's like to look at your life like a runaway train and try as you might. You can't figure out how to find the lever to pull so you'll hit the brakes and come to an easy stop. You're just led into repeating patterns, doing what your father before you did, who did what his father before him did, or you're stuck in patterns of bondage, a slave to your own desires, which is just an agonizing paradox to be caught in. And we're looking for a way out. So how do we master the sin that's crouching at our door, as we heard? Genesis 4, I want to say, moves us toward an answer. Not, mind you, a fully explained step-by-step how-to solution and explanation. This is no like 7-step guide to being perfectly free from sin, right? The Bible is not a self-help manual, and I'm not here to sell you anything. So it's not cut and dry that way, but it moves us toward an answer nonetheless, and something that's at the heart of the gospel is hidden in this story. So let's turn our attention to Genesis 4 and to the family dysfunction of Cain and Abel. Genesis 4 introduces us to the second generation of the human family. Cain is born first. Not only is he the firstborn son, but he is, at least in the Genesis narrative, the firstborn of anybody, right? Adam and Eve are not born, so he's the firstborn in the family. And then sometime later, his brother Abel is born. Cain, we're told, inherits the family business. He kind of takes on the trade of his father. He's a tiller of the soil, a man of the ground, farmer. And Abel becomes a keeper of sheep, right? He's a shepherd. Let's pick up in verse 3. It says, in the course of time, Cain brought some of the first fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Now here's a pattern. It's being established right now. It's going to feature really prominently throughout the Bible, and especially in the book of Genesis. Sibling rivalry happens over and over and over again. You see, in the ancient world, there's a common practice, the right of the firstborn. If you're the firstborn son in a family, you're going to be given a certain extra measure of blessing and privilege and authority. That's your birthright. You're going to be given an extra measure of blessing. And God is continually, though, going to take the right of the firstborn and turn it on its head and do something totally different and unexpected. Something that would have shocked, maybe even angered the ancient world. He's going to elevate the younger, back the underdog. He favors Abel instead of Cain, Isaac instead of Ishmael, Jacob instead of Esau, Joseph instead of all 11 of his older brothers. This is God's pattern. If you're following your notes, God looks with favor on the overlooked. It's a contrary cycle to the cycles of privilege that are given by human beings. Now, we aren't told explicitly why God looks with favor on Abel and his offering as opposed to Cain's. Not spelled out in detail, but Hebrews 11:4 in the New Testament later tells us this. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. So that suggests to us there's something deficient in Cain's offering because there's something not right within Cain's heart, right? Abel is said to have brought what? The fat portions and the firstborn. Okay, that's ancient Near Eastern speak for the best of the best. He brings the first and the best of what he has to the Lord for his offering. It's a costly and extravagant gift. Cain, we're told, brings some of the fruits of the soil. And there's no indication that he brings the first and best of what he has. Now, we got to work with probabilities sometimes when we're interpreting the Bible. So I think this is likely, but the Bible doesn't spell this out in detail. So I'm willing to be wrong about this. But here's my best take on it. The Old Testament scholar Bruce Waltke, he calls Cain's offering tokenism, like religious tokenism. Cain is engaged in the outward ritual of religious activity, and he's going to church, he's got a Bible on his nightstand, he says his prayers before supper and bedtime. He's doing the religious stuff, but his heart is not turned toward the Lord, and so his offering is half-hearted. Of course, God sees and God knows, right? And one of the signs that our hearts are like the heart of Cain is religious tokenism. We go through the motions of religious activity, right? And then we hold up our religious trinkets and our religious activity to God. And we say, see, God, I'm doing the stuff. So bless me and leave me alone. And for many of us in the church, this is something we wouldn't want to say out loud. But this is what God sees in our heart of hearts. Bless me and leave me alone. And when the religious activity that we're engaged in doesn't pay dividends the way that we think it ought, we become like Cain. We get mad. God let me down. God didn't come through for me. God's not living up to his end of the bargain that I've made. Because we don't really want God's presence for God's own presence sake in our lives. He's not beautiful to us. He's not good to us. He's just a functional thing to be used to attain what we really want, which isn't him. I think there's something of this maybe going on in Cain's own heart. I know for sure it's something that goes on in my own heart and probably in many of our own hearts. Religious tokenism. But God, knowing this, he's like a good father. You know how you can just sense sometimes with a child or a sibling or a friend, something's off? So God, he knows, right? So he goes like a good father to Cain because he's paying attention to what goes on internally in him. And he does a check-in, right? He says, hey, let's talk about something. In verse 6, the Lord says to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. So this is the crucial moment. Everything is kind of hanging in the balance here. God has given an intervention to Cain, a gracious one, and he said, Cain, something's not right inside your heart, man. You better have your antennas up, radar on, be on high alert, because there's an enemy at the gates. There is a prowler outside who wants to devour you. And if you are not ready for this, it will. So be on your guard. Something is after you that you must master or else. Of course, we know how the story goes. Verse 8, Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. There's a bit of irony here. Abel, in his offering, kills the firstborn. And Cain goes and kills the second-born son. You know it's coming in the story. Everything points to it, but it still is a terrible tragedy. You ever had someone in your life that you just, despite your best efforts to help them, you're watching them crash and burn, watching them make all the wrong choices, and everything in you wishes you could save them from themselves because you know how this is going to end. And you've warned them and you've seen it coming and they haven't listened. This is how God must feel every time that we sin. He's watching Cain. He knows, he gives the warning, and Cain still goes ahead and walks into the biggest sin of his life that costs his own brother his life. God had tried to warn Cain. Part of the way that he does that, by the way, is reminding him of who he is, his vocation, his calling. If you can remember back into earlier parts of this series, working through Genesis chapter 1 together, God gives humanity a calling, a vocation. And a core part of that is what? Rule. He says, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the birds of the air, fish in the sea, animals of the field. Rule. You're royalty. You're a king. You're my ambassador. You have my authority. So bring mastery to the forces of creation, especially the ones that would seek to devour you and have mastery over you. But Cain abdicates his God-given standing as a reigning, ruling image bearer and instead chooses to become a willing slave to something which would devour him. He's trading crown for cage. He's turning it all over and becoming ruled by sin. To sin is always to become less human, because it's always an abdication of what you were made for. And we trifle with it because we don't understand, we don't know, we don't really believe. But it's a tragic loss of who we're meant to be as God's image bearers. If you're following in your notes, sin is a power that, if not mastered, masters us. There's a Croatian theologian named Miroslav Volf. And Miroslav Volf, he writes in his outstanding book, Exclusion and Embrace, commenting on this passage. He says, to commit sin is not simply to make a wrong choice, but to succumb to an evil power. Before the crime, Cain was both a potential prey and a potential master of a predator called sin. Cain murdered because he fell prey to what he refused to master. That's why we all sin, falling prey to what we refuse to master. Now, knowing how the story goes, right? Abel's name itself, as often is the case in Scripture, takes on some added significance. The name Abel literally means vapor or breath. It's the same word that's used over and over again in the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's translated vanity or meaninglessness. It indicates something that is fleeting. And sometimes life is that way. It's fleeting, it makes no sense. See, Abel didn't do anything to provoke Cain. He didn't deserve to die. He didn't have to die. Cain gained nothing from killing him. But he does it anyway. It's just a senseless killing in the fields of Eden. Makes no sense, but it happened. The philosopher Christopher Katzor, he reflects this. Cain's anger turns into rage against the injustice of the universe, rage against God. Cain would destroy the universe if he could. He would destroy God if he could. He will destroy Abel because he can. Abel didn't deserve to be the object of Cain's wrath. In truth, he really wasn't. But he was there, and he was the thing that Cain could control to extend and pour out his rage, his anger, his despair. And after he kills him once again, God goes looking for Cain. Why does God keep doing that? It seems he's always going looking for trouble. Would you read verse 9 aloud with me? It's on your notes to the screen. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" Am I my brother's keeper? See, God comes to Cain, and he demands an accounting for the treatment of his brother. And Cain, he asks this famous question. He asks it rhetorically, as if the answer isn't yes, obviously you are. And the question's purpose is to evade responsibility, but what it actually does is demonstrate his own culpability. If you're following in your notes, Cain's question is a self-indictment. It's a self-indictment. You know that line you hear if you ever watch like Cops, right? The Miranda rights. Anything you say can and will be used against you. This is that moment for Cain, right? Cain exposes the reality through his own words that in his heart, he does not consider himself responsible for the welfare of his own brother. And the question, I think, is a doubly painful one. I think there's a further knife twist in that question. You see, because, pay attention to this, right? Abel is a shepherd. He's a keeper of sheep. And all day he spends out in the field keeping watch, keeping care for his sheep. And Cain takes him out into those very fields where he's the keeper of sheep, and he kills him there. God comes to him, makes the accusation, and Cain responds, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And paraphrase that, what am I, a shepherd? Like, Abel is the keeper of the sheep. He's supposed to be the keeper of his brother, and he's deflecting his responsibility as caretaker and shepherd for something so much more valuable than a flock of sheep. I'm not responsible for that. He won't own it. And this is what God has been trying to get us to take ownership of since the beginning, since the bloody day in Eden. You are responsible for your brother, for your sister, for your friends, for your neighbors, for the stranger, for the vulnerable, for the enemy. We are accountable for these things. On one occasion, there's a teacher of the law who comes to Jesus. This is a story from the Gospels in the New Testament. And he's trying to get out of a responsibility to love his neighbor. And so he crafts a philosophical question. He's trying to get off on a technicality. And he says, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus goes on and he tells a story about a good Samaritan who at great personal risk and cost takes responsibility for someone who is both a stranger and an enemy. And then Jesus concludes this story in the exchange of this man with the command, "Go and do likewise." Go and do likewise. See, followers of Jesus are under strict orders to act justly toward everyone around us. We don't have the luxury of neglecting others in favor of self-interest or of harming them because we think they deserved it, even if they have. Even if they started it, they fired the first shot, they had it coming. Jesus won't let us off the hook for these things. Whether they deserve it in real or perceived ways, we are still accountable for everyone around us to treat them with the justice of God. And before we all, nod our heads too easy at that, like this is church rhetoric, of course. Because Consider the real world implications in your own life for how this fleshes itself out and for the life of our own culture as a whole. This has powerful implications for every aspect of our life together. This affects the way that we ought to treat migrants at our borders. It affects the way that we ought to treat the people in traffic that are around us. It affects the comments we ought to leave on Facebook, the way we ought to treat with kindness and respect LGBT people in our city. Every aspect of our common life is implicated in the responsibility we have to love our neighbor and care for our brother. As 1 John 3:11-12 says, "This is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother." If you're following in your notes, we are accountable to God for each other. In verse 10, God responds. The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Cries out to me from the ground. As it is written in Hebrews 11:4, Abel still speaks. But Cain hasn't heard his brother's cries. He hasn't heeded them, not when Abel begged for his life and not after the fact, after the crime. But God hears, and he says to Cain, listen. Listen. Listen for what? What does Abel's blood have to say to Cain that God wants him to hear? In essence, take responsibility. Own this. In the Psalms, there's a frequent theme where a righteous sufferer cries out to God for vindication and demands that God would plead their case, plead their cause against wrongdoers. This pops up again and again throughout the prophets, throughout the Psalms. It's asking God to judge, to prosecute the evildoer, to defend and vindicate the victim. In Psalm 43:1, great example of this. The psalmist says, "Vindicate me, my God. Plead my cause against an unfaithful nation. Rescue me from those who are deceitful and wicked." God tells Cain to listen because he wants Cain to reckon with the charges being brought against him by his victim, to take ownership of his sin and accept responsibility for the guilt of it and the consequences of it. That's what he wants. Own this. But Cain refuses to take responsibility for his brother, so he comes under a curse, like his father before him, patterns and cycles. In verse 11, "Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." If you're following in your notes, through an act of supreme exclusion, Cain himself becomes excluded. The very ground that is soaked with the blood of his brother becomes inhospitable to him, and he is driven out from the land and from the very presence of God. Now, for thousands of years, commentators on this passage have noted and wondered about the oddity of Cain being afraid of reprisals. I mean, it's odd because, well, of course, in the Genesis story, there's 3 people alive on planet Earth at this time, him and his parents. So who is he afraid of? If you go on and you read the remaining chapters of Genesis, especially Genesis 5 and 6, you'll note that there is a cycle of violence. Things go downhill south fast. It's a mess. It gets bad. And God interjects himself into the situation through the flood story. But with that in view, the perpetuating cycles of violence, this is probably what Cain has in mind. This is what he's worried about. That violence is going to beget violence, which is going to beget violence, which is going to beget violence, and someday, somehow, it might come back on his own head for what he's done. He's worried that his sin might catch up to him. That's what he's afraid of, and he's not wrong to be afraid of it. We know how the story goes. The cycle of violence is there. It's not out of place to be concerned with that. He's worried about it, and he probably has every right to be, because God knows and he knows what's going to happen with human sin as we continue to give in to the cycles and patterns of violence and estrangement from one another. I don't think there's any sense of remorse from Cain here. I think he still is on the path of self-preservation and self-interest. So God does something unusual. Let me pick up in verse 15 to finish the story. The Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." And then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now some people, they look at this mark that God has put on Cain as if it's a badge of shame or something. And although I don't doubt that Cain remembered to his dying day what he had done, this is not a scarlet letter. It's a shield. It's a seal which signifies to those around that this man is under divine protection. Even as he, honestly, to my shock and indignation, he doesn't deserve it. Even as he wanders from the presence of God, God still says, "I've got you. I will look after you, and I alone have the right of vengeance, and no one else." He remains still under the care of God. Now, can you see the resonance between this story and some of what's gone on in Genesis chapter 3, which Steve taught on previously? If you're following your notes, people sin. Sin separates us from God, from each other, and from the earth itself. Threefold estrangement. It's ecological, it's relational, it's spiritual decay, full-on cosmic crisis. And this cosmic crisis is going to get worse and worse and worse as history continues to repeat itself. But notice this, the pattern that's being established in Genesis runs directly contrary to the secular myth of progress. The secular myth of progress, it's dominant in our culture, is that given enough time and technology and education, we will be able to address all of the ills of our social order. We will solve the problems of the world. We'll end hunger, wars, poverty, addictions. We'll take care of those things. The myth of progress says that human nature is essentially good, and that if we can overcome all the external challenges that cause us to harm our environment, our neighbors, and ourselves, then individuals and society will flourish. What we really need to do is just get rid of the bad out there, like plucking weeds from a garden, and then what's naturally good within will flourish and find life. Genesis tells a different story. It's a narrative of regress, not progress. Genesis says that left to our own devices, humanity will destroy itself. Genesis is saying that we cannot be our own saviors because we are our own worst enemies. We are the ones who've gotten ourselves into this mess. There's something wrong within. In the 20th century, there's a Soviet dissident named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And he was placed in gulags doing hard labor for his criticism of Joseph Stalin. He was a brilliant writer, Russian Orthodox Christian. Later in his life, in his book, Gulag Archipelago, he would write this. And just compare this to the secular myth of progress. He says, "If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" So I'm not saying that society hasn't gotten better. I'm grateful for penicillin and democracy and air conditioning. Good things. What I am saying, what Scripture is saying, is that humans do not possess the internal resources necessary for transformation and creating the utopia that we dream about. If you're following in your notes, ultimate salvation is not to be found within human nature and activity, but in divine nature and activity. So look, if you end up reading this story just as a cautionary tale, encouraging you to master sin. And if you mess up, well, hey, tomorrow is a new day. Clean slate, blank slate, start over, try again, do better. You have missed it. That's the moralistic reading. That's the moralistic story. Places a lot of optimism in human nature. But it's not the gospel story. The gospel isn't telling yourself day after day after day, don't be Cain, don't be Cain, don't be Cain. Choose better. The gospel story is acknowledging, to start with, I am Cain. That's my beginning place. Each of us has to own the fact that our hands are stained with Abel's blood. And it cries out to God for our condemnation. That's what Abel's blood is speaking to us. But the gospel is also that the blood of Christ cries out to God for our justification, for our vindication, for our righteousness and forgiveness and reconciliation. And that is the hope that's buried like a kernel in the ground in the story of Genesis 4. God always pursues and intervenes, and he's made a way through the better blood of Jesus, spilt for our sake. So our part, at least the beginning of it, our part in breaking the cycle of sin, in escaping these patterns of our family of origin, of being liberated from the bondage of selfish desire, our part is to own our part in making the mess in the first place. That's where we get started in breaking free of those cycles and patterns and bondage. This is what Cain repeatedly fails to do, and this is God's invitation to us. Take responsibility for our vulnerability to sin, for our complicity in sin, and for the debts we owe to love our brother and our neighbor. And we start there. And that, and only that, will give us the humility to live according to grace and to walk out of the way of Cain and into the way of Jesus. So I want to do in just the few minutes we have remaining here is invite you into a time of taking spiritual inventory. It's natural that a story like this would lead us into a place of confession. God has gone looking for you today. And maybe he wants to ask you a question and invite you to own something. What would that be? What would that look like? So the team's going to play, and we're going to give you just a moment as they play and sing to have a moment of speaking with the Lord. And if you want to sing with them and stand and sing out your confession, you're welcome to do that. And if you want to remain seated and be silent and have a moment between just you and the Lord to pray your confession, we invite you to do that. And let me just say, I recognize confession is not one of those fun, cheery things, but it is so core to the gospel. And it feels painful, I know, but I think Jesus would tell you, don't be afraid. Those are not death pangs, right? Those are labor pains, and new life is being born. So take a moment as the team leads us to respond however you need and have a moment with the Lord.
Thank you for listening to this week's teaching. If you'd like more info on our church, you can visit our website or find us on Facebook.